Now, it is indeed true what has been said about me, that my background very much is in agrarian studies. You will see that my title is Professor in Agrarian and Labor Studies. And what I will talk on today, while you cannot work on anything that relates to rural areas without understanding agrarian issues, is much more on the labor side. Therefore, the title, Structural Labor Discrimination in India. Let me see if we can get the presentation going. So what I will do is I will talk on the topic is structural labor discrimination in India, Adivasi and Dalit seasonal migrant workers. So a specific group. There's of course also other discrimination, also other labor discrimination, but that is the groups that I'm focusing on. I do so, this is the brief outline of my presentation. I first discuss inclusive development and structural discrimination, some aspects of that. I then move on to the main topic, namely discrimination of Adivasi and Dalit migrants. And I conclude, after having presented various kind of evidence on that, I conclude relating to some of the findings, of course, but also some of the concepts that I develop as part of this. And I look into the future where, of course, it's always tricky to do, but I'm certainly arguing that what we're seeing is, while there indeed is very much structural discrimination, that is also changing over time. The impact of caste and tribe differ from what it was 100 years ago, and I'm engaging with that. And that takes me to a number. I wish I could say policy recommendations. It is not quite as concrete, but at least the policy focus, a discussion of what issues then are of importance in relation to dealing with discrimination. So that in a nutshell is my presentation. First, what is the relationship between inclusive development, the theme of this conference, and discrimination? Well, as was already pointed out, inclusive development is a slightly nebulous term, but it's clear that it certainly relates to issues of growth and equal opportunities. Ravi Kambur and his collaborator put these definitions out there a bit more than a decade ago, saying that it relates to creating opportunities and making them available to all. And you can already hear there that discrimination is the antithesis of this kind of inclusive development. So in order to obtain inclusive development, discrimination has to be dealt with. And I thought for that reason it would be a good focus for my presentation here. What do we understand with discrimination then in relation to labor? Here I go to the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which of course in a sense is the international lawmaker, maybe slightly short of that, but at least the organization that agrees conventions that governments then put into laws if they so wish. And they define discrimination in their ILO Convention 111 on discrimination in employment and occupation as any distinction, exclusion, or preference made on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, political opinion, national extraction, or social origin, which has the effect of nullifying or impairing equality of opportunity or treatment in employment and occupation. So a very broad definition. Anything that nullifies equality of opportunity or equality of treatment in employment on occupation that relates to these kind of distinctions are seen as discrimination. And the ILO in principle takes this very seriously. The ILO has its fundamental principles of rights and work, rights at work. There are 5 principles that they claim to be fundamental that all member states of the ILO must take seriously, and this is one of them: the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. So in principle, this is high on the agenda of the international community. I do say in principle. Now, I thought a good next step was to say, okay, so what is the evidence of discrimination globally? And there isn't any sort of good handbook on labor discrimination globally. But short of that, I have here collected a number of data examples of work-related inequality and discrimination based on race and ethnicity. Evidence from the UK and the US, not because I find these countries particularly important in this sense, but because they've got good data. So here we have a number of statements, and I don't know, can you see the writing from the back? Okay, excellent, fantastic. So I won't read them aloud, but effectively it is clear that when we are looking at the categories whites, Black and African American, and Hispanic and Latinos, when we're looking at what kind of jobs the different groups have, the whites are doing much better than the other groups. And when we're looking at wages, it is the same pattern that is clear in the US according to the data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And in the UK, official figures show exactly the same. Here there are different ethnic groups that are worst off. The Bangladeshis are the worst off of all the groups that are listed by the UK statistics. But the overall picture is the same. Work-wise and income-wise, the white British group is significantly better than most other groups. And now, so that is inequality. Is it discrimination? It is only discrimination if it is due to treatment based on race, ethnicity, etc., as I listed before. And there are people that have looked into this, and their verdict is clear. The inequalities are due to differences in qualifications, but the reason why qualification differs is that that certain groups are historically discriminated against and therefore haven't had access to education. So that is discrimination, as well as it is due to ongoing discrimination in access to work and pay. Simply, direct discrimination. You are not getting the job because you have the wrong skin color, belong to the wrong ethnic community. You're paying less because of that as well. So it is quite straightforward. Discrimination exists and has an impact of employment and pay. Let us think a bit about what do we mean by labor discrimination. Well, we had this definition, but what are the processes we're talking about? Well, it's certainly direct labor market discrimination, which can be individual discriminatory practices at work. So when you're working, you may be paid less, you may be bullied, there might be violence based on identity, that you might be excluded. It might also be individual practices that are discriminatory relating to access to work. You don't get certain jobs because you belong to certain social groups. And when there are a sufficient number of these kind of individual cases, it is no longer just bad apples. Then it is an actual collective discriminatory practice we're talking about. Which, for our purposes, may be based on race, ethnicity, caste, tribe, religion, gender, sexuality, disability, etc. So now it has moved from being individual practices to being collective practices. And this is where maybe it makes sense to start calling it something slightly different. A term we have developed, myself and my colleagues, working with this ILO report, one of the first reports the ILO has made in the last 10 years on structural discrimination. One term we coined there was structural labor discrimination, by which we mean distinctive, stable patterns of labor discrimination that are linked to relatively stable social constructs and ideological structures. And when you talk collective discriminatory practices, that is really what you talk about. It is also what you talk about when you're talking discrimination in access to skills. And that is important because most people that work on discrimination, including most ILO work, really is only interested in direct discrimination. They do not think of why is it that certain groups have less access to skills than others, which can also be discrimination. And they very rarely mention that that is often based on historical discrimination, as in the cases I mentioned before. So discrimination due to historical oppression and exploitation that therefore put certain groups in a disadvantage. And that is what I mean, all these aspects listed there when I talk about structural labor discrimination. And it was great to see the ILO accepting to publish this report and therefore maybe taking further its work on discrimination. Now, but is this important in the sense, is it something that will just go away, or is it with us? Now, classical modernization theory, and also a good deal of classical Marxism, would argue that economic development would do away with such pre-capitalist social oppression and discrimination, including racism, casteism. Sooner or later, we would all be workers with only one identity, workers. But there are others, a fair few people, I must say, that argue this is actually not the case. And here I thought it would be interesting to just refer to Thomas Piketty, partly because he's an economist, partly because I like his work. His 2020 book, Capital and Ideology, is very clear and documents very clearly that there is not a unidirectional development where discrimination based on racism, casteism, etc., becomes less and less. He argues and shows very clearly that from around the 1970s onwards, there have been a shift towards new inequality regimes from the more equality regimes that existed in particularly in the West, but also maybe were developing in certain other countries. So away from them towards new inequality regimes that were based on identity and ideology. And he argues that what was happening was that neoliberal elites from Reagan onwards consciously went for that, consciously tried to create coalitions with white working class people against black minorities, against Muslims, against the immigrants, particularly in Europe, reinforcing identitarian cleavages. So changing the way, changing the previous more egalitarian alliances that were based on class to alliances that were based in this way more on identity and therefore excluded certain groups. Piketty is not the only one that makes that argument. There's a whole group of sociologists and anthropologists, Stuart Hall may be the most well-known of them, that have argued very strongly that actually the cultural-specific character of the labor force is central to capitalism in general, that race, gender, and other forms of difference are essential for what he calls differentiated form of exploitation. In order to have segregated labor markets, you need different identities, to put it very crudely. And of course, there are people that goes even further. Cedric Robinson, racial capitalism, sees racism as central to capitalism. Silvia Federici sees unequal gender relations equally central to capitalism, etc., etc. We're not going there today, just to show that there is a whole body of literature that explores this area. Now let us get to India then. But I thought it was important to outline these issues in order to make clear that when we're talking India, when we're talking discrimination in India, of course it is India specific what we're talking about, but it is actually a global phenomenon that there is labor discrimination based on identity, and that it is well entrenched in countries across the globe. India, it is what I'll do in the next 2-3 slides is just to give you a brief number of facts that are well known, but that are, I think, nevertheless important just to point out. So I will do this very quickly. So firstly, it is well known that India is one of the most unequal societies in the world, and that it is not getting better. It is also well known that the economy has had very high growth rates for the last 25 years, but very low employment growth, in particular in the last period for which we have data. And here and elsewhere, I'm not including the COVID years. One could argue one should, but that is a decision to make. There's too much unknown of that period to consider that without making that the biggest part of the presentation. So I'm not doing that. It's also clear that India has not experienced a classic agrarian transition, by which I mean a transition where growth in agriculture has led to capital being transferred from agriculture to industrial growth, and therefore a change from an agrarian economy to a manufacturing economy. While indeed employment within agriculture, as we can see on this figure here that I have lifted from Basola's work, while indeed agricultural employment is falling, it is construction and services employment that is increasing, whereas in manufacturing it's not going anywhere. And maybe as important as that, the kind of transition we're seeing is a transition without decent work, where whatever change that is happening within employment has not led to an increase in decent work. We've had a fairly stable, slightly falling, but a fairly stable percentage of the population, around 90% of all workers that are informal. One thing that's interesting there, if we go into details, is that there has actually been an increase in regular employment over casual work during the last 20 years, which could be good. I mean, casual work is the worst kind of work. You have regular employment means you may have certain rights at work, but it so happens that of the regular employment, there is the actual amount of people that have written contract is very low, only 30%, and it's decreasing. And of those with contracts, by far most have short-term contracts. So it does look as if what we're seeing here is increasing short-term contractual work taking over. And I can give some examples here based on not my own work, but for example on a PhD student of mine, Suraj Telenge, that has worked on Amazon. And at Amazon India, the case is that workers do indeed have contracts, written contracts. They are for a month at a time, or 3 months at a time, and they never last more than 6 months. Very few gets 9 months. Most only get one month. So yes, it's contract. It doesn't change much, and workers are paid slightly more than they are if they're casual workers. But it doesn't change a lot in their actual de facto casual status. If we look at Dalits, Adivasis, and a few other important groups, Muslims and women, just to when we look at it at the general figures, then there's also plenty of evidence of discrimination. And of course, discrimination against Dalits and Adivasis is historically well known. They stigmatized, oppressed the bottom of society, and I guess it's also well known that even today these two groups have the highest poverty levels, and that the average income of these groups and also other groups compared to the income of higher caste workers is abysmally low. And there are examples that compiled by Ravi Srivastava of that even in jobs there are often unequal pay for these groups compared to a general caste population, even when they have the same skill and the same education. On top of that, when they have the same skill and education, their educational premium when it comes to access to job is actually less. You need to be better educated to get the same jobs if you are from these groups. Another example of discrimination. And when it comes to white-collar jobs, the famous studies by Torrad and Newman are very clear that there's overt discrimination in the job application process against Muslims in particular, but also Adivasis and Dalits. That is well documented. Likewise, it is well documented that women, while with their very low and falling workforce participation ratios, are overrepresented in low-end jobs, and that there's a gender pay gap. So overall, it seems fairly clear that we are looking at discrimination here. Continuing this to seasonal migrant laborers, data is much less forthcoming. Basically, there is no proper national data on seasonal migrant labor. Hence, the numbers are disputed. Some would even say between 40 and 100 million, so potentially up to 20% or more than 20% of the labor force, or it could be less, are circular migrant laborers, so spending time of the year away from the villages where their household is, working in another job to return later on. We have no reliable data, but it's a big number, whatever the number is. It is also clear when I say there's no data, there's some samples, some very poor data on interstate migration, and those ones shows that Dalits and Adivasis are overrepresented when it comes to migration. Dalits and Adivasis makes up 25% of the population. They're estimated to make up 40% of seasonal migrants, so a lot more. And the jobs they do are nearly always low-end migrant jobs. They are doing what UNESCO have called the 3D jobs, dirty, dangerous, and degrading jobs, which locals do not want to do. So they are hyper-precarious, have the lowest wages and longest working hours. The sectors they dominate in is agricultural laborers, brick kilns, and they're also overrepresented within construction, manual transport, low-end manufacturing work, and low-end service jobs. They are often employed through labor contractors by what that means of possibilities or fears of labor bondage that can follow from that. And importantly, when they migrate, they are generally treated as second-class citizens, by which I mean when you migrate, you have little access to welfare schemes. You have little access to housing schemes, schools, health care, social security, cheap or free food through PDS, and you will suffer from being harassed by police and of a strict policeman, and harassment also from the general public. So overall, you are deprived of a multitude of citizen rights. There are many studies on that. I'll not go into that, but that is clearly evidenced. You also suffer from being deprived of labor rights. You are more exploited than locals. You cannot expect solidarity from locals if you try to take actions. You have, in that sense, de facto no rights to organize, and there's widespread stigmatization. This is something I will show in more details in what follows. So it seems quite clear that we are talking about discrimination of these particular groups, of these migrants that are consistently at the bottom of society and the economic hierarchies, also in the modern economy. So therefore, this is not sort of a relic from the past. This is something that should concern us all today as well. So what I'll do now is I will present a number of case studies, and so this is mainly qualitative data. I'll do that to make up from the absence, partly to make up from the absence of other data, and partly because I think it gives us a better understanding of the processes we're talking about. Of course, you cannot prove anything with a single or with a few case studies, but you can certainly provide a thick description. And this is based on research projects I've been involved in, being part of chairing, partly one that led to this book, Down by Growth, and partly my long-lasting work in UP. So these pictures you might recognize. These are most of the pictures in the presentation are pictures I've taken myself. These ones are not. These are, as you know what they're from, I think, from the COVID days, the early COVID days, the walk home. But so I will give you a number of case studies here. The first one relates to my work in UP, in Jaunpur district in East UP and Muzaffarnagar district in West UP, two villages I know well. And the short characterization of them in relation to this topic is that we have quite extreme inequalities here and structural discrimination of Dalits. Here we have the Thakurs of Jaunpur sitting in their very nice air-cooled room together with me, drinking tea. And we have the Dalits doing the same from the Dalit hamlets here. So it's just sort of visually sort of quite in your face. So attacking it a bit more systematically, if we're looking at the jobs that people have, if we're looking at the Thakurs and Jats, and if we define good jobs as jobs where you earn more than 20,000 rupees a month, and by the way, by far most of the households, both of the Jatas that used to be agricultural laborers and of the Thakurs and Jats that are the dominant landowning caste, by far most households have jobs outside of agriculture today, and hence the focus on what they do outside of agriculture. Outside of agriculture, as you can see, Thakurs and Jats have good jobs. There are some fantastic examples here. I just have to give you one, which is the Thakurs of Jaunpur. They have managed to buy into or draw on a Thakur network in Mumbai of UP Thakurs that are engaged in construction, that have been funded by illicit money, according to that is what they tell me, and they have made a killing over the years, engaging in the construction industry there. The house we see there belongs to the most wealthy of them all, who used to be just middling in the 1980s, but through this construction boom now has invested 8 crore of his own money in setting up an educational and certificate institute nearby, so that is quite extreme. We see the Jatas. Some Jatas have what I've called good job or okay jobs, by which I mean jobs where you make between 10,000 and 20,000. That can, for example, be the jobs in like Amazon. It can also be jobs. In this case, it is jobs in the automotive industry around Delhi, where they work for up to 9 months at a time on a short-term contract, and then gets booted out and wait for the next contract. But they earn 12,000 after the initial. After the initial year, can earn up to 16,000. But most have low-end jobs, below 10,000, brick kilns, construction, and the like. So there's a clear difference here, extreme inequalities in work. At the same time, we see a clear out-migration of Jatas. They have moved out of agricultural work, they migrate or commute to work now. And because they're moved out of agriculture, of course, agricultural work still has to be done. So what has happened is that we see in-migration from elsewhere, where a good number of Adivasis from Jharkhand now work in West UP in the Muzaffarnagar village, doing the sugarcane work that the local Jatas do not do anymore. And in East UP, it is agricultural work and brick kiln works that Dalits and a few Adivasis from East UP, Bihar, and Jharkhand have taken over. So we see quite strong moves of people to jobs they consider better. Both in locality and where people from the locality goes. Okay, so now I have a set of, I think it's 3 cases that draws on the big research project with the book that I just mentioned. That was a research project that involved 5 anthropologists working in 5 different fields in India, looking at inequality of Dalits and Adivasis and their work patterns in the places you can see here. It wasn't planned like that, but it so happened that in all places we saw seasonal migration, and in all places we saw, and in many of the places we saw in-migration from both in-migration from Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha to these places, whereas people from there migrated out. Now, why do people migrate from Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Odisha? And that is another important aspect when we are discussing seasonal migration and discrimination. Well, they do it because they haven't got good options to continue there. In these particular cases, of course, issues such as mining, struggles over land, and the civil war matters and impacts why people migrate. In other parts, in Bihar and East Uttar Pradesh, that are other main centers for out-migration, it is simply that Dalits, that it's mainly Dalits from there, have very little land. Land distribution is caste-based. There are very few jobs in agriculture and outside of agriculture, and caste discrimination is high, so people would prefer to work anywhere else. So we see people move from these parts to other parts of India. This is, I'm sure, well known to people here, but I think it's worth pointing out nevertheless. Let us take a couple of the cases. First is what goes on within agriculture. Now, in general, it's clear that Adivasis and Dalits are overrepresented among agricultural migrant workers. For example, sugarcane harvesters. The picture there, sugarcane harvester, bill workers from the Nandabal region that works as sugarcane harvesters because their land has been submerged. And they've got some compensation, but nevertheless they do that. And the conditions of sugarcane harvesters are historically famous or infamous. The sentence by Jan Bremen, "Even dogs are better off," regarding sugarcane workers, sadly is still fairly true. Another aspect of agrarian work is tea plantations. One of the team worked in tea plantations in Kerala, which actually the workers there were also migrant workers, but they migrated 150 years ago, Tamil Dalit workers. But with neoliberalism, whatever rights they had achieved were being rolled back. And when they went on strike, because of that, the tea plantations reacted by importing workers from elsewhere that would not strike, that would be cheaper, that would not demand the same living conditions, and that would work harder. So there was a case of Adivasi workers and other workers from central and eastern India that undercut the local Dalit workers. That then some of them have now moved, many of them have moved out of tea plantation, trying to find work in Tirupur, wherever else they can find work. Brick kilns and the construction sector is the other, if we take them sort of by rank, sector where Dalits and Adivasi dominate numerically in the brick kilns. And again, I won't go much into that, but it's well known that seasonal labor bondage exist. It's common. Labor contractors is very common. It's maybe not quite as bad as it's sometimes made out, but it is not good. And the construction boom sector is another important area, both for Dalits and Adivasis, also for other groups, OBCs in particular. Dalits and Adivasis make up more than a third of the workforce, so they're still overrepresented in this sector, and they do the rock bottom work there. Construction is tricky because there are often advances and you're paid at the end of the job. So again, that leaves room for all sorts of shenanigans between employers and employee. Compared to local construction workers, one of the big progresses of the 1990s onwards have been the provident funds and social security in certain Indian states for construction workers. This is very much for local construction workers. I have not come across provident funds that have actually reached seasonal construction workers to any that they've benefited from. I'm sure it exists, but it is not the common pattern. On top of that, within the sector, Adivasis are mainly work as helpers, and they're paid less. The NGO Ajivika that works in Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Mumbai have done some have spent time documenting the conditions of the people they work with, and they have this brilliant piece in an article they've written. The Adivasis are the best workers. They don't know anyone. They don't negotiate, and they have nowhere to go. So that is talking to an employer why he chooses to employ Adivasis. Finally, it's the last sector to deal with here, the broad sector of manufacturing. Here, Adivasis are also here both Dalits and Adivasis are also disproportionately employed, but less than in the other sectors. Now, there are fewer studies of Dalits and Adivasis in manufacturing, but whatever is there tends to show that they get the worst jobs. One example is again from this big research project that we ran, where one of the cases was in a locality where they were in the chemical and pharmaceutical industrial belt in Tamil Nadu, which is a very modern, expansive belt with local and foreign investors exporting to the foreign market. And in this particular place in Cuddalore district, there was a factory where many of the local Dalits used to work or worked, where a factory that produced gelatin from cow bones. It's quite hard work. You carry cow bones. You use chemical processes to break them down, etc. They did that. They were hired through the old landlord's wife who had become labor contractors. So the old systems were maintained in a sense, which we also saw in the Telangana place where we studied. And again, the pattern, when they protested against their conditions, the factory brought in migrant laborers from elsewhere to undercut them. So the migrant workers are still there. Some of the Dalits are back, and the situation from the tea plantations is the same here, where the migrant workers work harder. They work 3 to 4 shifts in a row. It's incredible. They sleep at work. They take it in turns to go off to a corner and sleep, so they can put in as many rows as possible, as many shifts as possible, because they're there to make money, so they can go home. Then that's what really. So they will push themselves to the limit, and when they go off from work, they sleep in a rented village house in shifts. There are not enough beds for everyone, but because the work is in shifts, they also sleep in shifts there. That's enough of the misery of the attempt to paint a picture here. Let us look at how does this system actually work? What keeps it going? Well, if we look at it from the worker's point of view, an important aspect of it is, without this aspect, you couldn't do it. That is, that the seasonal migration is underpinned by an invisible economy of care. By that we mean that migrants rely very much on the work undertaken by others in the household back home. That includes care provided by the spouse, by the children, by siblings, by the parents, who would all keep the home running back in the village while the migrant is away, who will also make sure there's a space where the migrant worker can be cared for when the migrant is too old or too worn out to work. And whenever there's no work, because most of the work is seasonal, this is a place where the migrant worker can go back to. it is not only care in that sense, it is also based on economic activities. Dalit and Adivasis will often have land or access to forest. Both Dalits and Adivasis might have livestock back home. Dalits certainly will work, Dalit women will work as part-time agricultural laborers, while the men are migrating, and in that sense they provide a livelihood for kin at home while the migrant labor is away. So it's both care and the income that is necessary to maintain that care. And maybe one sideline or aside here is, if we include these people that are totally integrated in making seasonal migration work, making it possible, then the total number of people that are involved in seasonal migration increases from the 60 to 100 million to a much higher numbers. So one should not underestimate the importance of seasonal migration. It goes well beyond the 60 to 100 million mentioned before. But to go back to the main argument, so this invisible economy of care, what it does really, if one looks at it structurally, is that it enables the employers of the seasonal migrants in the factories, in the kilns, in the construction sites, to pay them less, because they can effectively externalize the cost of their reproduction. Workers normally, in a classic sense, a worker would be paid also to maintain the family and look after the kids, there would be pension, etc. This is all cut here, because that is not needed. Social reproduction, the invisible care economy takes care of that elsewhere. So the costs have been externalized from the employment process. And we call that, we couldn't see a way not to call it super exploitation compared to normal employment relation. And that, of course, is the standard when it comes to seasonal migration, the way it's organized. Both here and also elsewhere, there's a decent literature from the mining industry in southern Africa from the 70s that point out exactly this as well. So it's not an India-specific phenomenon, but it is a phenomenon for migrant laborers. And one also has to mention that for this to work, how can you treat people in ways that are not the way you want to be treated yourself? Well, you have to other them. There has to be a difference between us and the others. Otherwise, people would not accept those differences. And when we're talking about this kind of discrimination, it's clear that it is underpinned by a public discriminatory discourse, both against migrants and against Dalits. The term Bihari says it all. And this is one way of denigrating migrants. And of course, there are also cases of atrocities against migrants and against Dalits in general, which all reinforces that discriminatory discourse. It is also the case that several state governments treat seasonal migrants as second-class citizens by not giving them access to the same programs as citizens from the state have access to. And there are, of course, also the case of sometimes the police is more slow in dealing with perpetrators of violence against these groups than against others. So there are many things that reinforce this discourse of that it's possible to treat migrant workers in this way. It must also be said there's very often active collusion by local workers as well. We saw how migrants will sometimes undercut local workers, and in order to defend your jobs, you might also go out against migrant workers. So that is also the case, both along workers' line, against caste lines, and against the religious line, of course. And this actually is quite similar to the structural discrimination of international migrants elsewhere in the world. So again, it's specific the way it happens in India, but it's actually not a phenomenon that only happens in India. Migrants are always discriminated against and treated and othered and treated less well than local citizens. Okay. Let us. I have a couple of slides of conclusions, and then we're looking forward to policies. First, the conclusions. The first part of it is really just repeating what I've said already. I think it's beyond doubt that there's structural discrimination of circular seasonal migrants, and that it is, one can show that it is based on tribe, caste, and region, and that it's particularly Adivasis and Dalits that suffers, in particular from certain regions. But not only, migrants come from other regions as well. And that discrimination is not only about how you're treated at work, it also conditions what work migrants can get. We see them slotted in at the lowest and in the worst kind of sectors. But of course it also impacts how they're treated at works. And it is enabled by, structurally, and it enables super exploitation of migrant workers, as they are undercutting local laborers that have certain rights, including local Dalits. So it's the tea plantation workers, for example, were Dalits. We have sort of theorized this as conjugated oppression. Again, that is a by the by point, but it's there's a literature on this which Bourgeois working in Latin America argues that discrimination and class exploitation are constitutive. This is not a question of class or discrimination. It goes together. One cannot understand. When it goes together, they interact explosively to produce an overwhelming experience of oppression that is more than the sum of the parts, is his argument. So that is certainly one way of conceptualizing it. Let's then move on from this to say what is then how to see this in a historical perspective. What is happening? And the argument we're putting forward in our work, and that I'm putting forward here, is that there is a quite changing nature of discrimination. That if we look back historically, discrimination of Dalits in particular was, of course, based on purity, pollution, stigma, and oppression. And what we're seeing now is much more simply naked, power-related structural discrimination. This is not so much about who you drink tea with or where your shadows fall, as it is a very direct labor discrimination and oppression that does not, again, the term Bihari says it again, the employer doesn't really care who you are as long as you will do this kind of work. So it is not the old-fashioned way of stigma and oppression. It's also not the classic patron-client based in the village kind of discrimination. It's a much more impersonal society-level discrimination we're talking about here. So one could certainly argue that neoliberalism has led to a stratified labor market that is based on sometimes quite brutal power, but less and less of religious symbolism for Dalits and Adivasis. I'm of course aware of increase of other kinds of religious symbolism in India today, but it is not primarily directed against Dalits and Adivasis. So that, well, that's an important issue, but it's not directly relevant in relation to this. So in that sense, I think one can argue that what we're seeing is in a global perspective, that the labor discrimination in India is becoming more similar to labor discrimination elsewhere. It is not to the same extent based on Indian religious idioms and norms. It is simply based on how are certain groups othered and therefore have to take certain jobs. If one should go a bit more into sort of thinking about what it is that is changing and how it is expressed, one thing that strikes me is how both globally but also in India, sort of the old justifications for discrimination and oppression, be they on race, on caste, simply cannot be spoken directly anymore. Certainly not by the respectable mainstream. In the UK where I live, there are certain words you just can't say anymore. And so things are talked about in euphemistic ways instead. So the demeaning versions of old racial and caste tropes are not part of the mainstream anymore. They are maintained by broad sections of the publics, including by dominant ethnic groups, white workers in Europe, and probably also by dominant caste workers, from what I understand. And they do so because it defends the small advantage those differences give them. They have a reason to kick down, to maintain their own position. So I think one can argue that what we're seeing is some sort of mutation of racialized and caste-based discrimination, while the structural discrimination, the underlying discrimination, is maintained. This is maybe not the only tendency, and the future, who can predict the future? It is of course true that we're seeing authoritarian populist regimes in different parts of the world that are finding new ways of othering others, and so there are other trends as well. But I think this particular trend is reasonably clear. Now, just if I may, a couple of 2 more slides on policy focus. How to achieve inclusive development without discrimination? I think it's fairly clear from this presentation that it is an uphill struggle, and one can talk about it maybe in different ways. There's sort of the more radical ways of changing it. One would be simply to abolish the informalized rock bottom jobs in India. I mean, a different kind of economic growth, a growth that wasn't based on super exploitation, but based on high skill and a high wage economy, would of course do away with the need to other certain groups and for these jobs to exist. I don't think we're seeing that happening right now. I think that even the increase in the short-term regular work that I mentioned earlier really streamlines the existing dispensation, doesn't change it. But again, if we go to Thomas Piketty, that is one of the things that preoccupy his thinking. How can we globally make the world more just so that countries also in the global south can change the way they produce? And so there are so interesting long-term thinking going on there. Of course, one could also say this could be dealt with through laws. I mean, why not improve the labor laws, and why not improve labor law implementation? I guess it is also clear where the direction in general are going in India these days with the new labor laws, but I hear there are interesting initiatives by law scholars to do so. So one could always hope. One could also start elsewhere with the international community. Anti-discrimination is a global issue. There is the ILO Convention 111 on discrimination that does deal with structural labor discrimination across the economy and bans it. And all governments, including the Indian government that has signed the Convention 111, ought to consider this. There's also Convention 107 that is particularly focused on indigenous and tribal populations, which, as part of the convention, lists the protection of land of tribal populations and is against labor discrimination of indigenous populations. So another internationally signed convention that ought to show the way. There are also more radical views. The UN, for example, deals with, highlights the need for reparations against racial discrimination. So historical discrimination requires reparations. That is mind-boggling to think of what that could mean in this case, and I do not foresee anything happening like that. But it's just to show that the ILO conventions are actually small steps compared to what would be possible to think about. And when we're talking small steps, there are, of course, also existing government programs in India and the idea of future government programs in India. And I've listed some here that all would be useful. Private sector affirmative action, more NREGA work, proper citizen-based rights social programs for migrant workers, and maybe take inspiration from elsewhere, such as South Africa, where there's an equality commission that oversees all racial issues in relation to work. So there are many things that could happen if the will was there. But we shouldn't only look at the international or and long-term perspectives and government perspectives, but also what can labor organizations do. And here, so the obvious point to make is that labor organizations, both old and new, ought to focus on structural discriminations against the Adivasis and Dalits and migrant laborers. This is sadly not an area that most labor organizations prioritize, but it would be good if there are people present in the audience representing such organizations to hear more about what could be done, or if this is an area that ought to be done. And of course, one could also deal with the root causes to why people migrate. Proper land reforms for Dalits would be a major structural change that has few mainstream buyers. And there is the protection of Adivasis, their lands and their rights against removals from their lands, which could also impact on the need for Adivasis to migrate. And so you can see there's a long way to go. These are all difficult issues, thorny issues to raise that probably require, most of them, long-term work, because there are entrenched interests, be they other labor groups. I mean, unions represent first and foremost the workers that are organized within the unions. They are not the migrant workers and the Dalits and Adivasis. So there are tensions, there are interests that ought to be dealt with. But I take hope from the fact that the alliances between working people for pro-poor anti-discrimination policies have been successful in the past. There have both been periods of Indian history, but also periods of Western European and American history where such alliances have been dominant, and it has led to decrease of inequality and discrimination. So one can always say it can probably happen again, of course not in the old ways, but in new ways. And I hope this will inspire to think of such issues in the discussion of inclusive development. Thanks.
I'm sorry, do you? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, this is. I wish I had a good academic explanation that made clear why this was the best case to study. That is not the situation. I have, for personal reasons, always been interested in understanding India, and it was more while I worked on India, issues such as these arose, because I worked with the relations between first agricultural laborers and farmers in UP. I then realized caste was an important aspect of that relation. And as they migrated and became migrant laborers over the 30 years I worked here, I followed them. And the topic of my interest became their conditions when they migrated. So it's, in a sense, you may say slightly flippant, the topic chose me. It wasn't me who chose the topic. And certainly choosing India was a very different kettle of fish. That was coming here as a young student and finding it so intriguing that I had to learn more.
Let's go to the gentleman in the red shirt with his hand up. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. Thank you. Great talk. Very informative. I'm Biplop, by the way. I'm a journalist. My question was, like you've talked about primarily agriculture and construction worker labor. My question was, like we have seen in the recent years, emergence of especially in urban areas, gated societies, right? And with that, what we've seen a boom of also service sector, labor that is also migrating from different parts, like non-urban parts. And so my first, specific question was whether your theorization of, whether your theory of, conjugated oppression and super exploitation, as you put it, and your whole theorization of this issue of migrant labor and how on identity-based, oppression happens, plays out, does it extend to service sector labor? Number one, and number two might be a slightly, I don't know, I wanted to see if you have any explanation of recruitment networks, right? So in terms of labor that is coming in, right? So one is obviously migrants, when they're moving, they contact with their family networks or village networks through which they migrate. But the other side is also there are people who are recruiting them, there are as I mentioned, gated societies, maybe big universities, and my very limited experience through college and through a little bit of work, I've seen there are maybe identity playing out in terms of recruitment as well, who is recruiting. It's like a migrant working on a land, under a landowner in an agriculture field, to a migrant working for another sort of upper caste, organization maybe, So is there established sort of pattern there in that recruitment? So these two questions, if sorry if it's a little long. Yeah, thank you.
No, thanks so much. And of course, these are not easy questions to answer. I can tell you what I know, and I can tell you what I think, which is not entirely the same. When it comes to parts of the gig economy, it is parts of the gig economy involves investments, and therefore you are automatically talking to a different kind of caste composition. Parts doesn't. If you're looking at for example, well, it is often not considered, but if you're looking at the Amazon warehouses, it is workers that work there. And again, drawing on my PhD's fieldwork, and I hope he doesn't mind, it seems clear that the people that get those jobs tend to be predominantly, but not only Dalits, with BAs. Because you need to speak English, you need to read the signs in English. So you need to or either BA or ITI certificates, so that you can deal with that particular situation. So they're considered good jobs, but for certain social groups. So the patterns continue. There are certain groups that are considered the best for this kind of hard work. And I cannot expand it beyond that, but there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't take place in the service sector. Actually, the Ajivika people in Gujarat, Rajasthan also shows how Adivasi become helpers of cooks in Gujarat. So that's another example where the service sector chooses Adivasis as the low-end part of the work. So I think that's as far as I can go. So, but I think certainly one could reasonably expect, and it's something to be researched, that is the general pattern. But I can't say that for sure. Recruitment networks. It is hugely interesting and not enough researched. And there are so many different ways recruitment takes place. A couple of good colleagues of mine, Jens Lerche and Richard Axelby, argued in 2018 in contribution to sociology that the recruiters have become decentralized, that it's more a member of the workers that is the recruiter now, and that is certainly one tendency. On the other hand, you also have the putting in place of registered recruitment agencies that recruit hundreds, if not thousands, of people. For example, for Amazon, but also for big construction sites. I have not got any evidence on whether they are caste-specific in their recruitment, but I think it is as important to think of it the other way around. Who is it that want these kind of jobs? Or who is it that are forced to go for these kind of jobs because they cannot go for other jobs? And to understand discrimination, one has to understand that level. It doesn't have to be a mean recruiter. It is the system that means that certain people are deemed the ones that should do certain parts of work. And I hope that the ILO will follow up on the report I was part of writing to be interested in that kind of structural discrimination, which of course is a lot more difficult to engage with than the odd person that directly discriminates.
Yes, over here by the aisle with the white shirt. Yes, you, please. Go ahead. If you could stand up so we can see you a little bit easier.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the insightful session. I'm Neetu from National Law University. So my question is, financial literacy and bridge schooling to seasonal migrant children will lessen the impact and arrest the exploitation and discrimination of the next generation. What would be the best way to impart these two into the system, as you have mentioned, emphasized on structural change?
So could you just repeat the first part? I didn't hear the first part.
Sir, I feel financial literacy and bridge schooling of the seasonal migrant children, financial literacy part for the adults, these two would arrest the exploitation and discrimination of the next generation. So what would be the best way to impart these two into the system, as you have emphasized on the structural change?
Again, it's another very good question, which I sadly can't be the oracle to give you the answer to. But you're totally right that even though it is so that the job premium or the educational premium when it comes to job is less for Dalits and Adivasis, and that can be shown statistically using all India data. It has been shown statistically using all India data by KP Kannan. Our case studies shows it in all the villages we've worked in as well. So even though that is the case, it is still the case that you are better off with education than without education. And I'm sure the same will be the case for financial illiteracy. The problem is, of course, what do you do if your parents are brick kiln workers? And I think one of the pictures I had was of a school. I didn't mention it, but it was a school for the children of brick kiln workers that had gone to the kilns. And some states, certainly Odisha, has put in place schools where parents can put their children in when they migrate if they so want to. And that is certainly one, I'm not sure how widespread it is, but it exists. And that is certainly one way of thinking about it. And I think the initiatives for this we will have to go to states that have large proportion of their population working as migrant workers to find the good initiatives. Because that is where there is a demand for it. So that's all I can give you by way of answer. But you're right, this is certainly one way of changing things. But just to add a twist, given the fact that in all the villages I've gone to, if there are both general caste people and Dalits, they don't go to the same school. The Dalits go to the state school, and the rest go to a pay school. And it might just be a rupee or two, but they go to a school so that they're not together with the Dalits. So you have a very strong discrimination also within the school systems. So it goes further than what I've just mentioned.
All right. I've been told that we only have time for one more question. Multiple questions? Oh, okay. You're in luck. 2 or 3. Wonderful. Okay. I see somebody in the back. Let me not skip out on the back.
My name is Manjunath. I'm an officer from the Labor Department. I have a clarification from you. In your presentation, you have mentioned that regular employment increased vis-a-vis casual work between 1999, 2000 to 2018-19. I would like to know the source of this data. Secondly, the question is, when do you think this discrimination against Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims would come to an end?
I can answer the first question very easy, but the second not so easily. I don't think I'm disclosing a state secret if I say that I've actually lifted that figure from the forthcoming report from the Institute of Human Development's labor reports. But they have it from the most recent periodic labor force survey. I haven't checked it myself there, but they have compared the data there with the data from early 2000s. So I've been a bit cheeky because it's not published yet, but that is the data. How it will come to an end? Well, I tried to outline various sort of suggestions, but I think that is probably an issue for the population of India, including, of course, the good labor departments and the implementation of existing legislations to answer that. Thanks.
All right, perhaps we'll take a couple questions and then you can answer them in turn. Let's have this gentleman over here. Oh, there's two of you next to each other. Why don't you both go?
Hello, Professor. You've written, and as I've had others, that the classical agrarian question stands bypassed in countries like India. So in the sense that the agrarian transition is not relevant anymore. My question is the failure to effect these transitions, is that why we see an increase in labor discrimination now, or is it the other way around? That is it because there's an option, there's labor discrimination that the agrarian transition or the agrarian question stands bypassed? So that's one part of the second two-part question. The other part is that historically states have played a huge role in effecting these transitions. In your policy prescription, you did lay emphasis on the social protection aspect, but the emphasis on job creation or industrial policy was not there. So what do you see? Do you feel like the role of the state in effecting these transitions is not available anymore? Is that policy path is that not available anymore, basically? Yeah.
Should we hear the other question? Yeah. Go ahead.
Good evening, Professor. And my question is that the fact that there is a historical difference between these two groups, the upper class and the otherwise Adivasis and the Dalit class, arises from the difference in endowment, and that too in terms of education, etc. The classic policy used by government is by providing educational reservation or employment reservation to this weakened section so as to bring them at par with that of the other section. However, what I have realized over time as a student is that there was a polarization before between the higher class and the weaker class. But with these policies used by government, like protection in education as well as in a job, is now creating a twofold polarization, one between the higher class and the lower class, and between one among these groups of people who are getting some kind of benefits of these policies of the government, moving in step upward, and they are continuing to enjoy that benefit, whereas those who are lagging behind are pushed further down. So this is leading to a three-part polarization in the economy. So does the policy which the government is using still justifies this identity-based? Thank you.
Thanks so much for these questions. I wish I had an hour for these two questions, which of course I haven't. So I will try to say something meaningful in spite of that, because these are huge questions. And so first on the agrarian transition. Just one sec. So the issue there was, the main issue I think is, can states intervene? Can states do anything to change the development trajectory today? I think it is, and it's not only me, there are many people that argue along similar lines that the way the markets work, there is very little pointing towards that classic agrarian transition will take place in India in the foreseeable future, however much many people would like it to happen. So the question is, what can India then do in order to enhance its economy and to maintain a proper standard of living for its population? And there are different views there. If you go to Prof. Patnaik, for example, he will argue you need to cut off many of the connections to the outside world. You need to support small-scale farmers. You need to have proper land reforms. So very radical initiatives. And the problem is probably that if India wanted to do job creation, strong interventions in the labor market, it would be very difficult to do so in ways that the international community would find acceptable within WTO regulations. So there is a point where if you want a very strong industrial and agricultural policy by governments, you do run up against international barriers. So it is a conundrum. I just pointing out Patnaik's solution. There will be other solutions that do not go down that route. But it is a tricky point, and I think it's very important to consider if India were to be serious about dealing with these issues. Now. The history about reservation and education. So my first point maybe to make is that in spite of all the well-meaning and important affirmative action by government of India that has benefited significant groups of Adivasis and Dalits, in spite of that, on average, Dalits and Adivasis are still the poorest in the country. So obviously it isn't enough. So the point is then whether one should dismantle them because of problems with beneficiaries within the groups of Dalits and Adivasis, class divisions within the Dalits and Adivasis, or whether one has to say this is too little and have to think much more radical than this, because at this speed it will take a very long time with these policies before anything serious is changed. So that is maybe not a direct answer, but it's saying that instead of going down the route as, for example, Anand Teltumde does, who is arguing that reservations are of no use, I think it's better to say how can they become of more use.
Okay, we have time for 3 more questions. So let's start over here. Yes? And then we'll move the mic towards the back and towards the left afterwards.
Good evening, sir. My name is Akshay. I have 2 questions, actually. So the first question is about how historically discrimination in the past was very overt, very explicit. So we could identify where discrimination was happening and where it wasn't. But over time, as we see right now in India itself, it has become very subtle and almost imperceptible. So how is it that policymakers do you think policymaking has adapted to this subtlety in discrimination against workers and laborers? And if they haven't, how do you feel policymaking should change in a manner that accounts for this change in discrimination? Since this, as you had mentioned, it's very difficult to get data on this, on discrimination. That is my first question. And my second question is about, you explained how discrimination is a global phenomenon right now. If it's race in the US, it's caste in India. So do you think policymaking, again, laws, labor laws, and international organizations that make procedures, make protocols for laborers and workers, do you think they should take up an approach that is global in nature, or do you think it should be country specific, it should be region specific? Because if the approach taken is global, then there is the risk of them avoiding fault lines and systemic problems in different regions, because different regions face different kinds of problems. So what do you think the approach should be? Should it be global or should it be regional in nature? Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much. Yes, how to deal with discrimination today when it's more subtle. In a sense, you could argue that this research I have engaged in is an attempt to do so, and an attempt to point out to policymakers that it exists and needs to be dealt with not as bad apples, but as who have access to which kind of jobs and why. So my hope is that, for example, the ILO in its negotiations, annual meetings with Government of India will take seriously their own conventions and discuss with Government of India what Government of India has done to implement those conventions. They do so already, but they tend to focus on important issues such as sanitation workers. But that is, shall we say, a very obvious point to make, that there is discrimination and sort of a very classic kind of denigration. But to go beyond that and also look at the more subtle discrimination that slots workers in at different levels and stops people accessing or stops the development for being inclusive, because they are excluded in what jobs that they can access. So that would be one way forward to shifting the discourse for what to focus on. And I mean, I'm saying the ILO, but of course that goes for all stakeholders that ought to do so. ILO, because they actually have conventions that deal with that. Should these initiatives be global or country specific? I don't see a contradiction between that. I think both are absolutely necessary, both in creating, shall we say, a counter discourse about discrimination, and that it is not on, because inclusive development is accepted very broadly internationally as a focal point for economic and political development and social development. But it's of course also country specific, because without engaging in this in India, both at national level and state level, nothing will happen. So just a twist. I'm also very drawn to aspects of the initiatives that Thomas Piketty are trying to engage in, that seeks to, in a very reforming way, of changing the balance of who benefits from international financialization, that could in principle also benefit governments that wished to engage with these issues.
Thank you. So let's take 2 more questions, and I'll just ask you to please limit yourself to 1 so that we do finish on time. But let's take them both, and then I'll allow Professor to respond. Sadwick, there's some people in the back. Let's ask the gentleman in the red scarf towards the right.
So, hi, good evening. Myself, Vignesh. I would like to hear your opinion on these things. The people who are working in the solid waste management and sewage treatment sector. First is, rather than moving this informal workers into a formal work sector, we are trying to make this informal occupation as a formal occupation by giving them identity cards, providing a safety infrastructure, such kind of things. And what is your opinion on this? And the second thing is the social entrepreneurship model, which the development sector is speaking in India now. Will providing a social entrepreneurship model to a worker by bringing them within the same occupation, like giving them an entire treatment plant or a dry waste collection center, we take away the discrimination practice based on their caste? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody on this side of the room? Yes, you. By the window. And let me just add, if you didn't get to ask your question, please know that you're very much invited to stay with us for the remainder of the conference over the next 2 days, and there should be opportunity to talk some more.
So, good evening. So this is just for my clarification. I found it interesting that you also included that, Muslim people are also like discriminated against. So, I would like to know, in what ways is it discrimination against Muslims different from the caste-based ones? And yeah, are there similarities, etc.?
Thanks so much. Yes, there's the classic ILO approach is formalization. whereas many NGOs would and movements would work on the smaller issues exactly by giving people some sort of minimal rights. We also see the move towards social security for informalized laborers as another area where informal labor gets more rights. It doesn't formalize them, but they get more rights. And I have, to me, that is the most likely way to achieve things in the short run. That is the step-by-step approach. It is, of course, also tricky because by doing that, there is sort of also an acceptance that these categories, that this category of work is somehow acceptable. It doesn't have to, it's a bit like child labor, how to deal with child labor, where there's two similar approaches. And I haven't got a strong opinion on, well, I guess my strong opinion is that it would be wrong to not deal with the here and now issues that informal seasonal migrants face. But that should not stop us from also thinking big and looking at other solutions, even if it goes against the ILO general approach to take it like that. Social entrepreneurship, it remains to be seen. I would of course welcome if it works. I'm probably a bit more skeptical there because I have not in the past seen. I mean, in the past there are. We see the Tirupur example. We see how entrepreneurs how it mushroomed through. In part because workers working for the first producers set up their own units. But to do so, you need capital. And these were nearly all from the same middle caste. They were not Dalits. Dalits tend not to have capital. So anything that involves access to capital is slightly tricky for Dalits and Adivasis. So unless there's a system that involves providing capital as well, and then of course there might also be discrimination, etc., etc. But unless the capital hurdle is crossed, I find it hard to see how it can work to minimize caste difference. It is also the case if you look at the existing figures. While then the Dalits and Adivasis are the two categories of if you take Dalit, Adivasis, OBCs, Muslims, general caste, they are the two categories with the lowest proportion of non-agricultural self-employed people. And there's a reason for that, that I just mentioned. Muslims, discrimination. So, two things there. Firstly, I have not worked seriously on discrimination of Muslims. It's probably one thing I would like to do because I feel it is a huge gap in my knowledge. It is also the case that so what I know is that the group of Muslims in India is much more heterogeneous than the groups we've been talking about here. You have old upper classes that are still upper classes, and you have the old Dalits that converted to Muslim that are still stuck at the bottom. So to take Muslims as one group and talk about discrimination, well, there might be ideological discrimination, but when we're talking about work discrimination, one has to be much more specific. My knowledge there is limited, apart from I have seen Muslims working in the same kind of low-end jobs as I've seen Dalits and Muslim migrant workers working in the same low-end jobs as I've seen Dalits and Adivasis, not in the same numbers, but certainly more than I've seen general caste people doing.
Professor Lerche, thank you so much. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everyone that this has been very valuable for us. So thank you so much for your time.